And it took me a while to realize that, because if I was only to use this controller the way that you would use any other controller, there's something off about it. We're jumping straight into it. The Wolverine V3 Pro, it has Hall effect sticks, the first for any Razer controller. It has up to 1000 Hz pulling rate wired on PC. It has 6 paddles, and we're gonna look at what this delivers and if it's any good. But with my own money, Razer is not involved in any capacity. Let's get into the box. For gamers by gamers. Bruh. And here we have the pouch, and in here is a 3-meter long cable. This is what we have here. So one zipper, nicely shaped. Inside the pouch itself, you have something to store your cable, and then 2 thumbsticks, one that is taller than what you usually find on the controller. And then you also have another one that is like a mushroom cap, which is the standard size, but with what is more like those older DualShock controllers from PlayStation. There is an anti-friction ring around the stick itself, but the stick themselves are covered in plastic, no metal rings here. And then of course we have the 2.4 gigahertz ultra hyperspeed wireless. When I read this, I think, well, that's marketing wombo jumbo. However, you'll see when it comes to performance, I was pleasantly surprised. I gotta give him that. We'll talk a little more about performance later. Fully operates in Xbox. There's no like PlayStation mode or Switch mode or anything like that, or D input mode. It's fully X input and fully Microsoft licensed. Should work on most, to not say all, of your games that does support the X input protocol, and that goes for any storefront. So Game Pass, Epic, Steam obviously has Steam input, so it would work regardless. You know, you shouldn't be having problems in terms of compatibility with this controller. It's something I often talk about in my videos. I love when manufacturers use different textures throughout their controllers. I find that it gives this sensory layer to holding your controller, and I will say that they absolutely delivered on this one. It's not necessarily obvious to the naked eye, but what you have on top is just a little more rugged, if I could say, than what you have at the grip. In the back of the grip, you actually have some rubber, and then what you have here is very similar to what you have at the front. It's a little more rugged, so to speak, but it's not quite exactly the same as what you have here. Also, the buttons are glossy. The D-pad feels also smoother overall than anything else, probably to help the glide motion. The function buttons themselves are glossy, and then you have what is similar to the rubber grip, but it's actually plastic, and they also have a little bit of texture on the paddles. You don't have texture on the triggers and shoulders. These are probably the only things that feel the same. You know, sometimes you have those little dotted grip. So let's talk about what they are. Now you have what feels very much like a micro switch. I think they call it mecha speed, mecha tactile action buttons. They do feel nice, absolutely. And I find that, for example, in the Razer V2 and V2 Pro, they had like very little travel. And of course I understand having low travel, but I think there's a fine balance to putting a button that doesn't give you enough of a response feedback. These feel very, very nice. The D-pad feels about the same. You don't have a center pivot per se, but the motion of the D-pad itself kind of sinks in a little bit, and that gives me, in my opinion, a nice response. I expect good results out of that D-pad. We'll see whenever we test it. Now, there's no other D-pads that you can change with this one. We have Hall effect sticks, so no drifts, better accuracy. The resolution, which again we'll see in software, is actually quite good. Also, in terms of the triggers, now we do have Hall effect. You also have hair trigger switch here, which you can push aside and make it into a button. And one thing that is very appealing to what I would assume a lot of people is the fact that you actually have 6 customizable buttons. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the back paddles here, and you have 2 up top, giving you a total of 6. Of course, you have your select start, your home button. You also have a 3.5mm jack at the bottom that will support headset. So let's talk a little bit about ergonomics. The moment I held this controller, I was like, ooh, that feels really, really nice. Ergonomics is going to be divided in 2 parts. My first impression, and we're going to talk about it again while I play. I find that this controller is really, really suited to force your grip into really having a proper hold onto the paddles and keeping your thumbs on the sticks. If that's what you're trying to do, I think this is a phenomenal controller, and one that gives you a very, very good grip. There's a little more to it, and we'll get into that a little later during this video. You know, compared to something like the Xbox controller or Xbox Elite, I do find, just from a comfort perspective, for the Xbox controller to be superior. However, from, you know how, for example, you're leaning back and just enjoying a game, I find the Xbox controller feels like that compared to the Razer controller that gives me a grip that feels more engaged, as in I'm in focus mode. I know it's gonna sound weird. It feels nice in a way that it is intentful. And in that sense, I absolutely agree that this is a controller designed for the competitive scene, for the esports scene, and competitive players overall. Now, it's not all rainbow and sunshine, and as I mentioned, we'll get back to that. You do have haptic feedback. I am not sure if it is a haptic unit or if it is rotary rumble. Usually it's pretty easy to know which is which. Not gonna lie, with this one, they have me a bit confused. Something that feels like it's in between a haptic and a rotary motor. So I'm really uncertain what it is, but it does feel nice. It's a nice rumble experience. It does feel more layered than the typical rotary rumble that you feel in Xbox licensed controllers. You also have a software, which we'll look into right about now, as to what you can do using the software, which, by the way, is available for both the Xbox platform as well as PC. This is what you see when you first open it. Once you power it, it'll show you your controller. You can change its name. You can also create profiles. If you look top right, you have a little gear icon. You can click on that to check on the firmware and, you know, the kind of thing that for the most part you won't be using. And when clicking on one of the profile, you'll have the option to edit. So when you click on edit, it'll lead you to this window where you have a few settings. Let's start with assign buttons, and you can map any of your paddles to a different function. And as well, I want to bring your attention to these little crosshairs at the bottom. So the one that is white on the left is for your left stick, right on the right is for your right stick, and the one that is whole is for both your sticks at the same time. When you click on one of them, it'll offer you to go to the sensitivity clutch. And what this does is it lets you change the sensitivity of your stick by holding a button, which is a pretty major game changer. In this example, I only mapped my left stick, and basically once I'll hit that paddle, it'll greatly reduce my sensitivity, as you can see here. Next is the thumbstick settings. The prevent double dead zone is an algorithm to correct your sticks to prevent any drifting at the center portion. Usually best to leave it enabled. Circularity mode is to choose between having a perfect circle or going over it. Here's how they both look. Dead zone will let you adjust the dead zone. I find that 1 or 2 is probably the better setting. 0 is a little too sensitive, and past that gives you a little too much algorithm corrected effect. And then sensitivity clutch is the same as we just saw. That is a killer feature from the software. Then after that, you can address your haptics. Pretty simple overall, different intensity, and that's about it. The Razer writing on the controller is actually RGB, so you can address either to have a solid color, or you can have the spectrum cycling that cycles through. And then last but not least, power saving to give a specific timer for your controller to be able to go to rest on its own. Now, if we go back to the first screen, you'll notice at the bottom left, there's something called wired controller settings. That wasn't there initially because the controller was connected through the dongle, but if you connect it wired, that option will appear, and when you click on it, it'll let you know about the 1000 Hz polling rate, which you can also achieve with a shortcut. But when you're in the 1000 Hz polling rate, you cannot adjust your controller. So you have to be on the Xbox mode to be able to do that. And of course, the PC mode will only work on PC. You do not have access to the 1000 Hz on Xbox. We'll get into Aimlabs and then Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the regular suite of testings that I do with my controllers. I am currently in the 1000 Hz mode. Wanted to make sure to do that. First round 20,000, which is decent for what I usually do. Before I go into my second round, let's talk about ergonomics. Holding the controller is one thing, and playing a more passive game, because much like I did with the Victrix BFG Pro review that I just did, I actually tested this one for a couple of days just to get acquainted with it. When playing a game where I'm in a leaning kind of mindset, I'm not trying to perform, so to speak, it's a very nice controller. It's when being into that engaged position, as much as I feel like that controller is kind of what's the word? It's imposing that kind of posture with my hands and grip. And it's when engaging into the way that I feel it wants me to hold it is where it kind of gets weird. I cramp up so quickly with this controller. And that's not to say that I never cramp up, but it doesn't happen a whole lot. And it never happens as much as with this. And that's something that caught me off guard because, again, when grabbing it the first, I was like, oh, that feels nice. And it took me a little bit of time to figure it out. And it is those triggers. That grip is designed in a way to make sure that you always have your fingers on those buttons and the sticks way more than any other button. You start shifting towards the face buttons and suddenly it doesn't feel as good. You start shifting towards the D-pad and suddenly it doesn't feel as good. And the worst part is you start shifting to the triggers and it doesn't feel as good. And that to me is the really huge negative with the ergonomics. And it really took me to get into that engaged position to realize that. I don't like the fact that the triggers, they force you to use your second phalange to actuate them. But it's not the only controller that I've seen do that. In fact, even the Elite controller does that as well, you know? However, the difference is the slope here is higher. So yes, you have to hit it with your second phalange or arch your fingers, but even if you do, it's easier to do. Here, the slope is really low and the kind of wing, the way that it pushes out is nice, but I'm not holding my controller like this, you know what I mean? That's how the triggers would make sense. It's if I would have my fingers like this. Of course I don't. So I put my fingers regularly, but the resting position that is comfortable is on those buttons. And it makes it, the way that your fingers are arched, I don't know if I can show it. It's basically impossible to actuate the triggers from that grip. And that's the part that completely kills it for me. And I'm not playing like this for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, who's to say? It's just not comfortable. I gotta be able to like rest my fingers at some place, and not like resting them in emptiness just doesn't make sense. While I understand the focus on making sure that you always have your fingers on your buttons, it's to the point that it would make more sense to make this your trigger. And that's where that controller turns me off, which I'm gonna do a round like this to see if it makes a difference, because I have not done that yet. I've realized that, but I haven't done it yet. It kind of took a long time to explain what is going on. So let me go ahead and do my second round. $23,000. That's a great number. That's you know, that's pretty high. In terms of the sticks are great. I'll give them that. The sticks are great. And what I showed you in the software that you can do to change, I'm not using it right now, but that I think is a phenomenal feature to have. Like for anyone that is specifically serious into FPSs, and I think this controller is definitely designed for these players. These are some pretty nice features to have on a controller, and especially with how good and reliable that this feature works. I mean, arguably, I wonder even if a feature like that would be accepted in a competitive scene. It's borderline cheating. Like it's one thing to be able to adjust your sensitivity before, but to be able to adjust it on the fly on a controller, it's something that is, you know, not unheard of on mice on PC gaming, but on controllers, that's maybe something I wonder about. But if you're at home, I mean, who's gonna tell you that you're cheating, you know? But yeah, I wonder more in a esport kind of setting. But as far as the feature, it really is nice. Anyways, let me go ahead and do one round with the hair trigger, and then I'm gonna do another round, but this time by making my extra button be the one that I used to shoot instead. $23,000. In fact, this is a new high score. I've experienced better hair triggers, but this is definitely up there. I like the fact that you have the feeling of pushing on an actual button, you know, because some hair triggers, they just stop your actuation from going down, and it's software corrected so that it goes from 0 to 100. But some hair triggers, like it is the case here, have button feedback, which I prefer. And this is what you have here. There's also just a little bit of travel distance, enough that it feels like you're actually pushing down on something. Very nice hair trigger overall. I really like the experience here. And I'm gonna try what I was saying. I just need to go ahead and switch it in the software. All right, so just to show you now, this button, so this one here, the mappable button, is now my shooting button. So we're gonna go ahead and try this instead. $23,000 as well. Now the score is extremely similar. Mind you, my accuracy is lower, and I will account that to me just not being used with that method. But I will tell you one thing, it's way more comfortable. And every round that I've done since the first one, I was cramped up. With this round, I was starting to feel a release. So that's the one thing that to me this controller does not do also well, is just holding the triggers, which is a little shocking, seeing as this is the most important thing and what market that this controller is going after. But by changing this button to my RT, it makes a world of difference. And even I could go LT and RT like this. I feel like that would be great. And on top of that, it gives me a way higher likeliness to be able to successfully hit my shoulders while still having a finger on these buttons. So yes, you do have these extra buttons up top, technically 2 more compared to most other controllers, but for you to be able to action all 3 on each side, so the 6 total, it requires a weird grip, and a grip that is uncomfortable. And if you're trying to focus on your triggers, it makes you away from your shoulders, away from your extra button. Yeah, so to me, that makes more sense than that. To me, that's the way that you want to hold this controller. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing that we're not used to. But I think if you get used to that, it could be one of the better controllers of the year. And this is a big statement. They really have something that is quite interesting here. It's something that is so different. And it took me a while to realize that, because if I was only to use this controller the way that you would use any other controller, there's something off about it. So to me, that's what makes sense the most. All right, let's go ahead and try the D-pad. Yeah, I really just need to make sure that I exaggerate my moves, and most times I get it, not all the time, as you can see now. Wow. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna give it a B-. It wouldn't be my preferred D-pad for fighters. I also am not a big fan of the fact that those arrows, they kind of stick out just a little bit. It's rubbing against my skin in a way that I don't like it as much. Yeah, I don't feel like I would get a 100% guaranteed hit rate with this one. It's definitely more pleasant with the glove, I'll tell you that much. Yeah, B-. B-. Real quick before we get into performance, someone asked if I could compare the V3 with the Bindbach, because I believe the Bindbach resembles another Wolverine model. I will say this, to me, just as a grip, it feels more comfortable. It's not exactly the same. I mean, they may share a little bit, but it's not exactly the same. This one is wider at the top of the controller, at least it feels like that to me. And the fact that both the triggers and the extra buttons are leaning upwards, they're way easier to press. Like the way that you're holding the controller and getting access to every button is a lot more feasible here than it is on Razer's controller. You also have texture, which personally I like. So I would say that just in terms of ergonomics, the Bindbach is probably, in my opinion, superior. It's a little bulkier in terms of the grips as well. yeah, to me the Binbach is just a better, in terms of ergonomics, when at least being engaged, it's just a superior controller. And the components and buttons of the Razer do feel phenomenal and amazing. So in terms of performance, that is another area where this controller shines. So yes, it's 250 Hertz, be it dongle. There's no Bluetooth, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that, but in terms of dongle and wired in the Xbox mode, it is 250 Hertz, but the consistency between wired and dongle makes it absolutely shocking. And that is probably, I don't recall seeing numbers this close on a cable and a dongle. It is really impressive, and it tells me that Razer must have spent a great deal really engineering the performance of this controller for the numbers to be this consistent from one mode to the other. So that is something that I do have to give them credits for. I think most people can expect from a controller like the DualSense. So for Razer to achieve that level of consistency, I think is commendable. So that's definitely a big plus. When looking at the 1000 Hertz pulling rate, I'm not able to say if it is that much better in terms of latency. I do feel, is it placebo? I do feel from my testings, not today, but just over the course of the last couple of days, that it did feel a little bit better when talking specifically about the sticks. Everything else feels extremely responsive anyways. You know, if you're going 1000 Hertz, it's specifically for your sticks. With that said, I test a lot of controllers, and I catch myself off guard realizing some very minute differences at time. So I want to believe that it is not me having placebo, and I would say that if you're to buy this controller, ideally try to use the 1000 Hertz polling rate as much as you possibly can, especially if you are playing on competitive games. When it comes to the price, Razer, as always, is never cheap, and this controller is no exception at $200 US. To me, Razer has a certain arrogance with their pricing, often, at least. I would say that when it comes to this controller, I find that it's priced more accordingly to the market, especially if it goes on sale. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not a cheap controller, and that's where I'm a little on the fence about the price. There's also a lot of things that this controller doesn't have compared to other controllers. It doesn't have Bluetooth. It doesn't have swappable paddles, different styles that you can have, you know, changeable D-pads. So it's not like it has everything, but the things that it has, it does extremely well, minus one thing. As I was saying, I'm just not a fan of those triggers. Arguably, this is something that you could also address with a piece of rubber like Play Vital. They have accessories for the Steam Deck, and I have some of them on my Steam Deck OLED for the back buttons that gives you that extra height. You know, if you were to find something like that for this controller and these triggers, I think it could greatly transform the feel and ergonomics and overall grip. To me, that's, you know, the missed opportunity. But beyond that, it's really good. And so that is it, guys. What I recommend, I would say yes. I think this is a fine controller. I think this is a product that has a very elegant look. I really enjoy the Razer logo. The components feel very much quality. The performance are good as well. Usually ergonomics is big for me, but I might be the exception here. But to me, what I explained makes so much sense, and this is really how I experience it. So if you are to use it like that, I think you would come to find as well that this is a very elegant and surprisingly ergonomically sound controller, as long as you hold it that way. I hope that was insightful. As always, let me know in the comment box how you guys feel about this controller. Do you think you might pick it up? Do you think Razer is being overpriced? To me, it feels like it might withstand the test of time. And as always, if you have any questions, make sure to drop them in the comment box. Consider hitting the like on your way out. And even better, consider subscribing to not miss the next video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.